You ever have one of those neighbors who thinks they run the whole block? Yeah, that's Karen, president of the HOA, self-declared property line expert and part-time weather expert apparently. It all started when I began building a gravel path on my side yard, nothing fancy. Just a little walkway so I could move tools from the back lot without dragging mud everywhere. Next thing I know, Karen's at my fence, arms crossed, claiming I'm violating HOA regulations by disturbing shared land. The thing is, that strip of land, it's 100% mine. I even showed her the survey. Still, she insisted I stop immediately and consult the board. I figured it'd blow over like most of her fake complaints, but this time she went a step further. The next day, she placed a huge wooden shed right up against the property, line blocking the path entirely. No permits. No notice, just her way of saying, "You're not going through here." I kept calm until the wind picked up. A week later, we had one of those surprise windstorms, the kind that rattles windows and sends lawn chairs flying. While I was out checking my gutters, I heard this low rumble, and then crack. Karen's new shed, the one she used to block me, was no longer on the ground. It had lifted, and what happened next was something no one in the neighborhood will ever forget. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this unfolded. It was wild. A few days before the windstorm, I had already filed a quiet complaint with the HOA about Karen's shed. Not because I was trying to be petty, but because it was literally on my land and built without a permit. I even emailed the property survey to the board and asked them to look into it. Of course, no one responded. Karen basically ran the whole show, and most of the board members didn't want to challenge her. So, I waited. I figured I'd gather my documents and deal with it the right way. I never expected nature would step in first. Now, this wasn't just a little garden shed. Karen had gone big, like 8x10, full roof, windows, and even a little decorative weather vane on top. She told the neighbors it was for seasonal storage. But the way she wedged it right up against the line felt more like a wall than a storage unit. It completely blocked my gravel path, and the worst part, she had the nerve to post a private property "do not enter" sign on my side of the fence. So when that windstorm rolled in, I was already frustrated. The shed had become this giant symbol of how far Karen would go to control everything. I'd checked the weather that morning, strong gusts were expected, but nothing extreme. Still, as the clouds rolled in and the wind started shaking the trees, something told me that shed wasn't built to last. I just didn't expect it to take off. As the storm rolled in, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the back porch to check on things. The wind was whipping hard, trees were swaying, and the shed, Karen's prized structure, was starting to creak. I could see the corners lifting slightly with each gust, like it was barely anchored down. I wasn't surprised. She had thrown that thing up in a day, probably skipped most of the basic support work. But what I was surprised by is the fact that Karen was outside, umbrella in one hand, phone in the other, recording my property like she was gathering evidence. I could hear her yelling over the wind, something about unauthorized walkway construction and stormwater runoff. I just stood there, staring, wondering how she could possibly be blaming me during a windstorm. She even gestured toward the shed, like I had somehow caused the danger it was in. Meanwhile, the shed was now shaking more violently. A side panel had already peeled back, and the little weather vane on top spun like a top ready to launch. And then another subplot started brewing. My next-door neighbor, Mr. Delgado, stepped out onto his porch. He had tried to stay out of the drama for months, but now he was yelling over the wind too. "Karen, that shed's coming down. You need to move." She ignored him completely. That's when I saw the shed lifted a few inches off the ground. The bolts were pulling free. This wasn't going to end quietly or gently. The wind hit like a freight train. I gripped the porch railing as the trees bent low and loose branches flew through the air. Karen, still holding her phone, had moved closer to the fence line, barking something about legal boundaries and evidence collection. Meanwhile, her shed was groaning louder with each gust, the back panel already flapping like a loose sail. Mr. Delgado shouted again, louder this time. "Karen, back away from that thing. It's not safe." She didn't listen. That's when the final bolt gave out with a sharp metallic snap. I saw the whole thing in what felt like slow motion. The entire shed rocked forward, the roof lifting first, then the base breaking contact with the ground. Karen turned, realizing too late what was happening. She stumbled backward, just out of reach, as the shed launched into the air, spinning awkwardly like some weird wooden kite. The wind carried it directly over the fence, and everyone froze. Time stopped for a second as it hovered mid-air, a symbol of the chaos Karen had caused. Then, gravity kicked in. It came crashing down not on her yard, not on mine, but squarely on Mr. Delgado's vegetable garden. The sound it made was a mix of splintering wood and snapping tomato cages. I couldn't believe it. Mr. Delgado just stood there in shock, mouth open. Karen looked from the crushed garden to the broken shed, then straight at me. And even in that moment, I swear she was about to blame me for it all. Before I could say a word, Karen stormed across the yard, now soaked and furious, her phone still recording. She pointed at me, shouting over the wind, "You'll be hearing from the HOA. You created this hazard." I was stunned. Her shed had been built illegally on my land, barely anchored, and somehow she was turning it around again. But then, just as I was about to respond, Mr. Delgado cut in. He wasn't yelling anymore. He was holding something, an old envelope, muddy from the rain. He said, "Karen, I found this in the mess." Turns out, it had fallen out when the shed crashed through his garden. He handed it to me. It was addressed to Karen from a contractor and invoice for emergency shed relocation, dated 2 weeks ago. That's when it hit me. She knew the shed wasn't stable. She had already been warned by someone to move it and tried to hire help, but must have changed her mind last minute to avoid admitting fault. Maybe she thought she could keep using the shed as a tool to block my walkway. Even knowing it wasn't safe, I looked at the invoice again, and what really stood out was a line item at the bottom: client declined tie-down installation. She had refused the one thing that could have secured the shed in high winds. Now the neighbors weren't just angry about the shed flying into someone's garden. They were starting to question everything else Karen had claimed. And the wind wasn't the only storm brewing anymore. With the storm finally calming and Karen standing speechless, clutching her phone, the neighbors began to gather. People had seen the shed go airborne from across the block. Mr. Delgado, normally soft-spoken, stepped forward holding the invoice. "You knew it wasn't safe," he said calmly, but firmly. "You were warned, and you still put it up against someone else's property." The crowd was silent. Karen tried to say something, blame the weather, the builder. Even me, Boot, no one was buying it anymore. Walked over to the broken shed, still resting awkwardly in what was once a thriving garden. Inside the wreckage were loose HOA documents, some damp, some half-buried under broken boards. That's when I spotted something odd. An official-looking letter from the city, addressed to Karen, warning her about unauthorized construction within setback limits, dated a month ago. She had not only ignored the contractor's advice, but also a legal notice from the city. We handed everything over to the HOA board the next day. By then, the pressure from the neighborhood was intense. Karen was forced to resign as HOA president, and the board announced a full review of her past complaints and decisions. The unexpected twist: a week later, a city inspector came by and told me my property had been listed for review due to neighbor disputes. Turns out, Karen had filed multiple false complaints in the weeks leading up to the shed drama. But this time, with all the evidence in our hands, the truth had finally taken flight, along with her shed. After the city reviewed the false complaints Karen had filed, they cleared my property of any violations and closed the case with a written apology for the inconvenience. That alone felt like a small victory. But what really made it worth it was seeing the neighborhood finally open their eyes to how much chaos she'd quietly caused behind the scenes. Turns out I wasn't the only one she'd been targeting with made-up violations and vague HOA threats. One neighbor said she was nearly fined for painting her mailbox the wrong shade of beiges, something not even in the bylaws of the HOA. Brought in a third-party mediator to help rebuild trust and clarify actual property lines and regulations. They've even started sending monthly newsletters to prevent another Karen situation. As for Mr. Delgado, we all pitched in to help replant his garden. He laughed about it eventually, saying he never thought he'd lose his tomatoes too. A flying shed Karen moved out a month later. Quietly. No goodbye notes, no last-minute stunts, just packed up and left. Maybe she realized the shed wasn't the only thing that collapsed. Looking back, it's wild to think a gravel path kicked off this whole mess. But in the end, the truth held strong, and that ridiculous, poorly built shed became a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked HOA power. So Yakarin tried to block me.